Jennifer?
Great. We're going to introduce the next speaker. And the next speaker is Dr. Denis Rancourt. Denis is a renowned scientist and social theorist, a researcher at Ontario Civil Liberties Association, and he was a tenured professor of physics for 23 years at the University of Ottawa. When I first encountered Denis was through the Canadian Academics for COVID Ethics, and I've been following his brilliant work ever since. He has conducted numerous evidence-based research and analysis that really challenge and debunk the mainstream COVID narratives. Dr. Rancourt, the floor is yours. Oh, you got to unmute.
There, that really illustrates my brilliance right there, going on and on under mute. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. And okay, I guess I'll just dive right in. I think that if we're speaking about education, one of the first questions, there are a few really big, important questions. And of course, Julie laid them out for us, but I'm going to say them in different words. Why am I here? Why am I here? I mean, some people have a tendency to ask themselves that, even as children. And I think that trying to answer that and really having an impulse, a desire to answer that leads you to morality, ethics, belief, the origin of the impulse for freedom, angst, the thoughts of mortality. It leads you to all of that. But there's another important question also. I mean, so that question, why am I here, I think speaks to the motivation of people for wanting to understand the world, understand themselves, know who they are, learn things, and so on. I think it speaks to the motivation, to the motive. And another really important question is, that's an immediate follow-up, I think, is, well, what is here? What is this thing here where I'm at? And I would like to explore some answers to that question today, because there's a huge gap in trying to answer that question. You know, what is this world that I was popped down into? There's a huge gap where a formal university education simply doesn't touch the areas that I'm going to talk about, essentially doesn't touch them. And the three large areas that I want to mention. And I think they're fundamental. They're at the heart of really understanding what this world is. And we never get told about it. And there's no encouragement to discuss it. And there's no reason to discuss it because no one else is talking about it. So often we don't even think about thinking about it. And that's these following areas. The first one that I want to mention is the fact that all social animals, including humans, inhabit dominance hierarchies. We organize and support and maintain dominance hierarchies. This is a fundamental rule of how social animals organize themselves. And you don't have to believe me. You can just look empirically at the world. And this is what you see everywhere. Everywhere there are social groups, social animals, you have dominance hierarchies. And what that means is that there are dominant individuals that are on top of the hierarchy, and there are dominated individuals, and they're kept in their place. And there are interactions that maintain those classes, social classes, those layers, if you like, within the dominance hierarchy. And that's a reality. So you can think of any idealized system of politics, whether you want to call it capitalism or socialism or anything, if it doesn't admit the very obvious reality that social animals inhabit dominance hierarchies, then it's just a theoretical construct. It's academic, as we like to say. So we're now understanding dominance hierarchies more than before, thanks to, among other people, physicists. One of my collaborators is a physicist who wrote a very important paper on dominance hierarchies as a theoretical physicist, and who made a simple model of what would happen if you just put individuals together and let them interact. How would society organize itself? You can now simulate this. You can do an experiment on the scale of millions of people on a computer and try to find out what would happen. And what he found, and I think this is so important, is that you will have a dominance hierarchy, and it will be more or less pointed in terms of it will go close to authoritarianism, complete totalitarianism, or closer to democracy, where you have layers that interact and where many people have a say, depending on two control parameters. I'm going to tell you what they are. The first is authoritarianism as a control parameter. And that is basically the probability that you're going to be able to win an argument or a fight as an individual. So in other words, will the institution, your boss, or the people above you always win without fail? Or is there a chance sometimes that you will win? So that parameter is one of the key control parameters to decide what this dominance hierarchy is going to be. And there's a second parameter, which is very important, and it's the violence of the society. And what that means is when you disobey, when you lose one of these battles for influence, to what degree are you punished? How severe is the punishment? Do you go to jail forever? Or are you executed? Are all your possibility of getting resources removed, and so on? So those are the two control parameters that in this simplest of models predict how quickly the society is going to gradually go towards totalitarianism. So one of the things that comes out in this study is that all these systems naturally evolve towards totalitarianism, but they do so at a slow or accelerated and fast rate, depending on what the value of those parameters are. So the more authoritarian the society is and the more violent it is, the more quickly you go to absolute totalitarianism. So once you understand this, once you see this picture of how it works, this incredible complexity of society, or whatever the social animal society is, once you get that basic understanding of what's going on here, and that the mechanics of interactions are such that you're always going to slowly or quickly march towards totalitarianism, and the only way to get back from that towards something that's more democratic is to have some kind of a reset or to adjust things. And so one of the things that society is constantly adjusting is those two parameters that I mentioned. How fair is the system of courts or of judgment, so that sometimes you'll win those battles? You have to adjust that. And if you let the elite or influential people adjust it in their favor, then it will go in the wrong direction, and you'll more quickly go towards a totalitarian system. Likewise, you have to constantly adjust what the punishments are, how violent the society is. If the punishment is too violent, again, you race off towards totalitarianism. So you have to have just the right punishment. And you'll notice that in our society, we're constantly doing that. The lawmakers and everyone is constantly adjusting those two parameters. And that's the origin of it. So this is just a computer model view that allows us to see a fundamental feature of this incredible complexity with institutions and people and systems and societies and nations and so on. So I think that's a very important area of understanding and research, is this whole idea of getting a grasp of the fact that you are living in a dominance hierarchy. And there's a lot of course, there's a lot of animal studies and biology related to that as well. And I have written a paper, for example, where I explained that the dominance hierarchy is stabilized in evolution by your biology. In other words, the fact that you are controlled by dominant people, you're subjected to that dominant stress, weakens your immune system, makes you more likely to be sick, makes you sicker, so you're less able to defend yourself and as an individual. You see where I'm going? So once you start thinking about this, a lot of things fall into place. Individual freedom and the importance of the individual expressing themselves and trying to get influence is one of the important counters to just society running off towards totalitarianism. It's fundamental. So that is an area that we need to look at much more in our educational systems, and if we're trying to understand the world. I want to tell you very quickly about two other areas that I think are neglected in this way. And the second one is, and they're all related, these three areas are related. The second one is what is known as geopolitics. Geopolitics is the most important higher level organizer on this planet and of our societies. What is happening geopolitically has more influence regarding our freedom of speech, how our national society is organized, whether wokeness is going to take over the worldview. Geopolitics has more influence on those things than anything else. And I have studied geopolitics in detail, written in particular a very large paper about it, where I showed, for example, the impact of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It was massive, that impact. It accelerated what we are called globalization tremendously. All the indicators fire up from that point on. It was the beginning of wokeness. That's where wokeness was born, because the UN made international conferences for the first time in its history that dealt with gender equity, anti-racism as a language issue, that you had to rid the language of racism. That was initiated by the UN at that time in the early 1990s. And so this extreme gender equity that, you know, the exploitation of young girls was more important than making young boys in a military conflict into sex slaves. It became more important. You had to balance. And so all these new ideas about what human rights meant and what was important, this new ideology from the Western world was created. And that was initiated by the UN. It's all documented. And it was infused into our institutions, and it is the origin of wokeness. And then that the academics and people who participated in that and who benefited from it just took off with it, and up to the points of insanity that we're at these days. And it'll go further if we let it go. So that's just one example of where geopolitics is important. But geopolitics is everything. It's more than the elites. It's more than the national economies. It's more than all of these things. It's huge blocks of nations that are actually competing. And COVID itself is a war measures thing that was applied to Western countries because war measures are needed, because we're in a large economic geopolitical war against the development of China and Eurasia. And that I have explained the aspects of the COVID measures in those terms, in geopolitical terms. And I believe that that perspective gives it a lot, allows you to understand it in a really deep way, and to understand why China and Russia have also applied similar things and so on. So geopolitics is very important, and it's highly neglected. The third and final one that I want to mention is, so the first two relate to complexity. It's hard for we little individuals to imagine the big world at that scale, at that magnitude, geopolitics. It's hard for us to imagine the complexity of the whole society as being a dominance hierarchy that is slowly marching towards totalitarianism. And it's also hard for us, because we have a very limited lifespan, to imagine what has happened and what the nature of the world is on a much longer time scale. And this leads us to the idea of evolution. Evolution is vitally important. I know that this is maybe less neglected than the other two, but it is extremely important to try to grasp how our species changes very slowly with time, and how the interactions between different compartments on the planet change with time, and to try to imagine how that is happening on very long time scales, and all the little changes that are happening over those very long time scales. So our immune system is evolving. Our physiology is evolving. Everything's evolving, and in response to the interactions between individuals on the planet. So if you have the view of evolution you can use independent and critical thinking and say to yourself, for example, what do you mean I now need to get 3 vaccines to be safe? The breathing animals have been on the planet, walking on the planet for 400 million years, and they have co-evolved and coexisted with viral respiratory pathogens all that time. And our immune system evolved under those conditions. And you're telling me now that I no longer have an immune system, that I'm in a terrible danger of these, for the first time in 400 million years, that the species needs these boosters and vaccines, you see? So when you look at it from an evolutionary point of view, it allows you to more easily say, this latest nonsense that the pharma industry is telling me may not be completely true. Okay, so that is the kind of, that's the benefit of having these broad views, is that you can make that kind of an analysis. So
Denis, I'd like to
yes.
springboard off of your idea of evolution, of things evolving. And I'd like to ask you the question, how do you see post-secondary education evolving in these times?
Well, I have seen it evolve since I was a student, and I was a professor and so on. And I actually wrote an article that was published in a peer-reviewed pedagogy journal, in which the title said that the educational system was driving us towards fascism. And I wrote this, more than a decade ago, and I explained why I believe that was the case. And so I think that geopolitics has affected our institutions, including the educational institutions, in a way that we, more than decades ago, much more, are about strict indoctrination. So right after the Second World War, there was a lot more economic and thought freedom, and you can feel it and you can see it. And it became apparent, and under the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was an economic agreement that ruled economics on the planet after the Second World War, there was a huge growth, huge freedom. Then the US unilaterally put an end to the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971. That was the first elbow, the first turning point towards a very aggressive globalization and ending the very democratic institutions that we had up till then. So that was the first turning point. And then 1991-ish, when the Soviet Union dissolved, that was like another huge blow. And I think that the educational institutions have basically followed that overall development throughout. So they are a reflection of how insane our dominance hierarchies are, as they are modulated by these geopolitical events. So I think universities are just what they're made to be always, and right now they're very bad.
Thank you. We're going to move to Anita Krishna.